This video is to help you understand how reform movements changed America. Most of the reform movements of the 1800s came out of a religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening. This revival lasted about 40 years. One of the main leaders was a guy named Charles Finney, who has been estimated to possibly help convert 500,000 people to Christianity. When he preached, he did not just preach that you needed to be saved, he preached that you needed to be saved and try to make society better. And because of this, many people began to start new reform movements to try to help society out. The Second Great Awakening was the first public movement where women were involved. They played a very public role in these reform movements. Sometimes they were leaders of them, such as in the prison reform and temperance reform, and obviously women's rights. The most famous reform movement that came out of the Second Great Awakening was the abolition movement, which advocated the immediate end of slavery in America. There were two main parts of the abolition movement. One part, and actually the most numerous part, was the free labor movement. It was against slavery because of what it did to the white man. They believed that it made the white man lazy, made him less productive. They believed the South was falling behind the North economically. They believed that it hurt white small businessmen because they could not compete against these huge plantations. And so they were totally against slavery, but they didn't necessarily like black people. And so their idea was send any former slaves back to Africa. End slavery right away, send them back. We even made a country in Africa called Liberia. And it was set up by Americans for American blacks, and American blacks ran this thing for 160 years. So this was the most numerous part, but the next part is the one that's the most famous. The most famous part of the abolition movement was obviously called the abolition movement, and it made the moral argument against slavery. It talked about how slaves were treated as less than human, how it separated people from their families, how it refused to let people be free, how it degraded people by the way it forced them to live. It made that moral argument, and that moral argument would eventually change America. The most famous book of the 1800s was a novel which told about the horrors of slavery, which was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. There are many leaders of the abolition movement. One of them was a guy named William Lloyd Garrison, who is a very radical guy. He put out a newspaper called The Liberator. He would go, wherever he would go and speak, riots would occur because he would do things like hold up a copy of the Constitution and say that this Constitution is a covenant with hell, and then he'd set on fire the Constitution. There were many times when he was beaten up, he was dragged to the edge of the ground. One time he was almost hanged. Sometimes he may have done more harm to the movement than others because he was so radical and so demanding of an immediate end that it turned more and more people against it. The Grimke sisters, they grew up in the South, but they became Quakers, and the Quakers were known for their disagreement with slavery, and so they turned against slavery, but because they could not speak out in the South, it was dangerous to them, they moved up into the North and began to speak out against slavery. There were also many African American leaders of the abolition movement. Many were escaped slaves, some were freed slaves, and some were just free blacks who had never been slaves. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who learned how to read and write. He became one of the most eloquent speakers against slavery in the North. He spoke all over the North and around in other countries also. Sojourner Truth had been a slave up in New York before they got rid of slavery. She was an imposing woman. She was about 6 foot tall. She was used to plowing the fields by herself, so she had these massive arms. with huge muscles on them. And she also was an eloquent speaker and spoke out. She never did learn how to read and write, but her words were taken down by others and had a big impact. Beyond trying to change the laws about slavery, one of the practical ways that the abolition movement fought against slavery was the Underground Railroad. The railroad was not underground and it was not a railroad. Basically, it was a network of people who arranged to hide and help fugitive slaves. They used railroad terms, like a conductor was a person who led the slaves to freedom. A station was where the slaves could hide during the day while they waited for nighttime to start traveling again. The most famous conductor was a woman named Harriet Tubman, who made 19 trips back down to the South and led 300 slaves to freedom. The end of the abolition movement came with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended legalized slavery in the United States. Now, there is still slavery around, and once in a while somebody gets caught putting somebody in slavery. Nowadays, it's usually sex trafficking, and they are then put on trial and many times put into prison. The women's rights movement also came out of the Second Great Awakening. Many of the women got involved because they'd been working for the abolition movement and saw that they had some of the same rights that slaves did, which was not that much. The main thing that the women's rights movement worked for during the 1800s was property rights and voting rights. Some of the leaders of the women's rights movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a very good writer, Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker from Nantucket, which was, interestingly, one of the few places in America where women did have equal rights. In fact, they were the leaders on Nantucket because their husbands were always off hunting whales. And so when they got back, they pretty much just followed around their wives because they had nothing to do until the next whaling expedition went out. Susan B. Anthony was a great speaker, and she became the best friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they worked together with Stanton writing speeches and Susan B. Anthony delivering those speeches throughout the 1800s. Lucy Stone, she was a leader, and she formed her own group. She actually split off from Stanton and Anthony's group because she thought working state by state would be better. But she was almost also famous because when she got married, she kept her maiden name as her last name rather than taking her husband's name. If you mark the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 as being the beginning of the women's rights movement in America, the end of the first phase, at least, would be the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. Women nowadays have equal rights. They have the right to vote. They hold office. There's women on the Supreme Court. There are women who are CEOs for all the major industries. So women do have equal rights now in America. The temperance movement also came out of the Second Great Awakening. It was focused on alcohol abuse. It was thought that alcoholism caused family violence, poverty, criminal behavior. With the Industrial Revolution, more and more men were being pulled out of the family home to go off to work, and the low pay and the monotonous work made many men despair, and some of them turned to alcohol. And in a lot of those cases, men would drink up so much that they would spend their rent money on alcohol. And so the temperance movement tried to convince people to turn away from alcohol use. People would take the pledge. They would sign a statement saying they were not going to drink anymore. That worked on some, but many people it didn't. And so then the temperance movement worked to try to get rid of alcohol out of the United States. In other words, make it illegal to buy alcohol. And they succeeded. In the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1918, that outlawed alcohol sales in the United States. And it worked, at least partly. The biggest cause of death for men in the late 1800s was cirrhosis of the liver, which is what you get from drinking way too much alcohol. After Prohibition went into effect, that went away as a major cause of death. The problem was many people still wanted to have alcohol, and they were willing to get it by illegal means. And this started up something we never had in America before, which was organized crime. People like Al Capone and his gang would smuggle in alcohol. Moonshiners would make alcohol and smuggle it around. And finally, the violence became so great that they repealed the 18th Amendment and got rid of it. But organized crime was here to stay, and we still have it here today, and they still work outside of the law, mainly the smuggling drugs and other things. Another reform was prison reform, which before prison reform, there really weren't the large prisons in America. You had jails, and sometimes if you were in debt, they put you in a cave and you had to stay there until somebody came and paid your debt. So it wasn't really practical. And so what prison reformers tried to do was to put these large places called penitentiaries where men, mainly, who were found to be against the law, would be placed there to reflect and to reform their behavior. It didn't quite work out the way it was supposed to. It became a place mainly to warehouse people until they finally had paid their debt to society. Another part of the prison reform movement was when Dorothea Dix began to visit jails and found that the mentally ill were in inhumane conditions. Many of them were chained to walls. Some were put in cages. People did not know how to treat the mentally ill, and so they did inhumane things to them. They would put them in freezing water or maybe almost boiling hot water, trying to shock them into their right mind. And so Dorothea Dix, what her idea was to get them out of there and try to get them treated in separate places that they would call mental asylums. And she began to have success in Massachusetts, and then she moved on to other states, and that became her life's work, was to try to get the mentally ill out of the prisons. Horace Mann founded the Common School movement. He saw poor children all over the streets. He saw them committing crimes. He saw that their future would be nothing if they did not get some education and have a place to go during the day. And so he started public schools in Massachusetts, and this Common School movement began to spread across the United States. He thought that all children should be taught in a common place, that they should be taught good citizenship, and that would help strengthen the country. It's one of the reasons why we have public schools today. So you can thank him or curse him for this movement. The first college to allow both women and African Americans to attend was Oberlin College, and that was opened in 1835. The second was Hillsdale College, and those two colleges are still around today. A final reform we'll go over today is schools for the deaf. Deaf people were isolated from society. Their own families did not know how to communicate with them. And a guy named Thomas Gallaudet, he opened a free American school for the hearing impaired in 1817. And this taught parents, it taught children sign language, and helped these families to be able to bond and to communicate with each other and communicate a whole community of deaf people in America. So these are some of the reform movements that came around in the early 1800s.